So the trusty guard Sentinel has got a new model, and also some new rules coming out in the Astra Militarum Codex. Let's take a look at some leaked datasheets and see what they might be doing in the new book. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where we've been going through the leaked guard codex, taking a look at some of the most interesting datasheets out of the Astra Militarum and seeing how they might be functioning in the 9th edition codex coming out shortly. We've gone over plenty of units already, but I did think another one that I was quite interested to see were these new Sentinels. Games Workshop have released them as a bigger and slightly chunkier looking kit. Often that goes hand in hand with a rules boost. As with all the other guard leak videos over the past week or two, these come from the big Morty and Glory leak compendium. It's basically shared a full leaks copy of the Playtester Codex from earlier in the year, complete with points, datasheets, weapon profiles, and some interesting details. Usual disclaimer that as these are playtest rules, there's likely to be some changes between these and the actual final published ones, but they will serve to give us a pretty good idea as to the broad strokes of what are going to be changing and what to expect. As always, I thoroughly recommend checking out Morty and Glory if you are a guard player. I'm sure he'll be keeping up some excellent coverage of the new rules coming out for the Codex, along with plenty of other Astra Militarum related discussions. Looking at today's datasheets though, we both have one for the Scout Sentinel and the Armoured Sentinel, both of which are kind of usable at the moment in the guard book. Generally they're a unit that you maybe want a few of, but not to absolutely spam. Really quite tanky units for the cheap points that they cost, but don't really put out too much firepower to actually be your main heavy lifters. I feel like that's a pretty good place for them as scout walkers really. Maybe a bit less suited to manning the main battle line, but can be really handy for screening out the enemy and scooting around onto objectives and being quite tough but also quite expendable. With these leaked rules, it looks like the Scout Sentinel goes up in points a little bit, up to 45 from the 40 that it is currently, though it still looks like the different weapons are remaining free. I strongly suspect that you'd still be able to take it in squadrons like you can previously. It'd be a bit weird if a Scout Walker that was this cheap wouldn't allow you to, though often I do think that it just makes sense to field individual ones, as it means that they're quite expendable and are quite good for zooming up, screening and putting on objectives without losing too many points when you do so. Statline wise, after the two, it looks like the Scout Sentinel has got more buffs than the armoured one. It goes up to a pretty solid movement characteristic of 12, up 3 inches from previously, and that really does make it a proper fast attack unit zooming around the board on those quick legs. It hits on 4s both at range and in melee, as you'd expect, and goes up to strength 6, toughness 6, 7 wounds, 2 attacks, a leadership 7 and a 4+ save. The 3-inch movement is definitely a nice boost. It should have no trouble getting onto objectives with that. Interesting that its combat is a little bit more scary than it was before, 2 attacks rather than the 1 that it had previously. And perhaps nicest of all, it's also gaining +1 toughness and +1 wound, a pretty reasonable survivability boost, though maybe just a little bit equivocal given that it went up 5 points as well. It will make it very decently more survivable against things that were strength 5 or strength 6. Heavy bolters will be far less threatening to the Scout Sentinels now. Apparently it's going to be gaining access to both the core keyword and the platoon keyword. Core, I guess, would allow it rerolls from things like the Castellans and the regimental standards in command squads. I feel like maybe it's one of the units that could afford to be core without breaking the game. DW has basically removed core from a whole bunch of things that were decently threatening shooting walkers and things previously. Things like the Abmec Iron Striders lost it, then got it back, and Dark Eldar, Talos, and Tau Broadsides were also big chunky things with core that had it stripped away. Could be interesting to see their eventual damage profile. My guess would be that they're still not going to outcompete things like Lehman Russ tanks when it comes to dealing the most damage that you can, but it will be fun to see exactly how far a Sentinel damage strategy could take you. The platoon keywords may be a bit less clear at the moment. Apparently it's going to allow some sort of way to get more detachment slots filled. I feel like it's only going to be a positive for the Sentinel, but what sort of benefits it gives you are a bit less clear. Platoon is also the keyword that allows you to get infantry orders as well. I wonder whether we'll be able to give infantry orders to Sentinels now, or whether it will have some other interaction and maybe get orders from tank commanders. I feel like whatever the platoon keyword does is maybe one of the biggest unanswered questions of the Guard Codex at the moment. In the current rules, the Scout Sentinel currently has a scout move. It gets to move 9 inches before the game starts, allowing you to potentially get up into the midfield and maybe hide from enemy shooting if they're getting first turn. Looks like it's going to be swapping that for a forward deployment special rule. Maybe not a particularly unexpected change that, so you could have this thing physically starting on midfield objectives if you wanted to, or at least maybe getting into a place that's relatively safe and you can move on to them in your first turn. I feel like that one's maybe a bit of a side grade really. It is very useful to just be able to reliably screen out the board. You'll be able to screen out enemy infiltrators and forward deployment units like that, so that is a big win, but you also won't be able to reactively move against how your opponent moves. Say for example, if you knew that you were getting first turn, then you could advance pretty boldly, get into a firing position and move forward knowing that you're not going to get shot before you get to move again. Or if you were going seconds, then you could potentially hide a bit more and try and keep the model safe. I feel like having that rule though does make a couple of Scout Sentinels into a really quite attractive pick for a guard army. You'll be able to screen back certain armies that way, and I feel like could be a useful thing for just trying to win the mission as a whole. Weapons wise, it seems that we don't have too many details. There's only a couple of weapon profiles, presumably most of them will be the same. Sentinels do pack a fair amount of generic heavy weapons, things like las cannons and missile launchers and things, which I wouldn't necessarily expected to have changed in the new book. I noticed that the rocket pod that it had was a bit of an unusual looking one, but at least from this it sounds like that's not going to be changing, and it does just represent a standard missile launcher. Would be kind of cool if they decided to give it different stats in some way, but I guess we'll wait and see on that front. If they do all remain free, then I feel like the las cannon and missile launchers are probably going to be the most interesting. I feel like they're a bit more solid than the autocannon in the current edition of the game, and I feel like they're still going to beat out the multi-laser as well, though that one does apparently have a boosted profile, 4 shots at strength 6, AP -1 and damage 1. A reasonable choice for killing light infantry. It'll do okay against orcs, but in general I feel like that just has less value than a big anti-tank shot at the moment. I'll also be kind of interested to see whether or not the Scout Sentinel gets to take the plasma cannon or not. Previously that was only reserved for the Armoured Sentinel. With a redesign of the kit though, they might just say that either Sentinel can take either weapon selection. Otherwise, for bits of war gear, it still looks like they have the option to take the Hunter-Killer Missile and the Sentinel Chainsword, both of which now cost you 5 points now. That means that the Sentinel Chainsword went up a little bit from 2 to 5. The Hunter-Killer is likely to be a bit take or leave, could add a little bit to the Alpha Strike, though only hitting on 4s is a bit unreliable. Maybe depends on what sort of other buffs that you can put on the Sentinel for whether or not it looks worth it. The Sentinel Chainsword though definitely got a lot more interesting. Previously it just gave your melee attacks AP -1 and was totally not worth it even at 2 points. Now though it does seem to make the Sentinel into a genuine mini melee threat. It gives it AP -2 and damage 2 in combat and also +1 attack for 5 points. I feel like a lot of people are probably still going to just want to keep the Sentinel as cheap as possible, but on paper that really is quite a reasonable damage boost for that amount. With that profile you've got a pretty reasonable chance of killing one infantry model, anything up to a space marine in a single round of combat, which compared to doing nothing against anything but the lightest of infantry, seems like it could be okay. Maybe it could be a bit more tempting if you're running a big trio of Scout Sentinels or something like that. At least in theory, 9 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2 look like they could be a threat to small squads. Though even with that, plus their shooting, I'm still not sure that they're looking like the absolute top damage dealers. Moving on to the Armoured Sentinel now, and apparently that's going to be an extra 5 points over the Scout. Currently they're the same points, so this guy will be going up 10 points from 40 points to 50. And to be honest, maybe isn't getting quite as many benefits as the Scout Sentinel from the change. It gets the same combat stat boost, a +1 attack and +1 strength. It only gets the +1 wound on the toughness front though, as it was already toughness 6, and it keeps its current movement characteristic of 8 inches. It does have the 3+ armor save though, so it's likely to show off firepower a bit better than the Scout one is. The Armoured Sentinels seem to get no forward deployments, but basically get an Armoured Hull special rule, giving you a +1 save against damage 1 weapons, looking kind of similar to the Track Guard's ability that seems to manifest itself on quite a lot of guard datasheets. I'd say compared with most of the battle tanks with their 2+ saves and things, that is a bit of a better bonus. It'd give you a 2+ save against things like bolters, so you're unlikely to take any real damage from small arms. It is just going to make this thing need to get taken out by heavy weapons. Otherwise, seems like it also has the option to take the chainsaw and the Hunter-Killer Missile. I'm not sure whether that searchlight that this one's modelled with will have any in-game effect, or whether that's just a nice bit on the model. But otherwise, at least according to this, it looks like the heavy weapons are still all free. I'd hope that maybe they might have fixed the plasma cannon issue with the current Armoured Sentinels, which if you roll a 1 it kills the whole model. I strongly suspect that they'll have rewritten it so it just deals 1 mortal wound to it, as that would be a lot more in line with the other plasma datasheets in 40k. If so, then the plasma cannon could be a really interesting option for it. I think it competes pretty nicely with the las cannon at the moment. Overall, if these leaks do turn out to be accurate, then it looks like they'll be fitting a pretty similar role to how they work now. I can't help but think that the damage output for the cost is still going to be pretty underwhelming. A single heavy weapon hitting on 4s most of the time just isn't that great for 45 or 50 points. Though I guess in theory, if there's a whole load of support for these, things like really good orders, stratagems, or core synergies, then there might be some way to make them work as primary damage dealers. I wouldn't personally be holding my breath on that front though. On the other hand though, the defense for the point really does look quite good with the extra wound and extra toughness on the Scout Sentinel. Having fast, tough and expendable units is really quite helpful in 9th edition, even if they don't do that much damage. It makes them nice as a first wave that the opponent has to deal with. Maybe they decide to jump out and charge these with melee units, and then you can counter-attack them with a bunch of firepower. The Sentinels seem like really good fast-moving units to get onto objectives early and force the enemy to commit. Any firepower they do on top of that just seems like a bonus. Out of the two, if these datasheets are accurate, I feel like the Scout Sentinel is going to be far more interesting than the armoured one. The extra durability is nice, I still think that they look usable, but I feel like the forward deployment just beats out the Armoured Sentinel for how much value it brings, and while it might not have the 3+ save or that armoured special rule, the toughness of the Sentinels really isn't bad for 7 wounds at toughness 6 for just 45 points, and of course it'll be even better than that if guard vehicles do manage to keep the Armour of Contempt special rule, though I guess that's not particularly guaranteed at the moment. On top of that, technically if you're 45 points more than 50, then the firepower will be a bit more efficient point for point, though I guess if you're going for some sort of Sentinel gun line, then the armoured ones might be better for the extra toughness. Really though, I think that forward deployment is the biggest selling factor. Start on far-flung objectives, maybe out of line of sight, and cap those points until the opponent manages to get to you. Even if they do catch up with you, then you're still going to be a relatively tough vehicle that's going to be a bit of a pain to take down, at least for the cheap points cost. Take a few pot shots at the enemy, or potentially against certain armies you could be a bit more aggressive and try and be disruptive. Say for example, if you were playing against Imperial or Chaos Knights and you happen to go first, you might well be able to move Scout Sentinels in a way that basically pins the Knight army in their deployment zone, as they don't have room to move past them. I guess that'll be a bit 50-50 as to whether you go first or second, but that does have the potential to be pretty devastating. If you park one of these in the middle of a movement lane, then the Knight army could basically be trapped in their own deployment zone and not be able to enter the midfield until turn 2, hopefully by which point you've had a lot more chance for your guns to get to work on them. There could also be a possibility for nuisance first turn charges against ranged units. Any enemy gunline infantry certainly wouldn't thank you for being in combat with a relatively tanky walker, even if neither of them are likely to do much damage to each other. Overall though, I think that they both look interesting. I'll certainly be looking to see what sort of synergies that they have when the actual Guard Codex drops. I'll be aiming to make some unit reviews of the new units, and of course review the Guard Codex in full once we get it. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see that, but I think in general it is looking pretty positive for the Scout Sentinels in particular. I feel like with that forward deployment rule they're very likely to be a solid part of a competitive guard list when the Codex finally drops. Let me know your thoughts though, which ones do you prefer and why, and would you be tempted to add any of these Sentinel kits to your Guard army? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular videos coming. I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Guard over the next few weeks and months. I'll try and cover any further rules leaks or previews, and also review the Codex in full once we finally get it. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that links down in the video description if you're interested. The channel's Patreon is what allows me to keep on making videos quite this regularly, so if you are enjoying a lot, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.